Who is piloting the UAPs or UFOs constantly seen in our skies? Where are they from? Why are they here? How long have they been here? What is their mission on planet Earth? Do they come in peace, or do they have more sinister motives? Join Mad Mark as he uncovers the answers to these questions and many more of the mysteries that puzzle us all on Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. And now, here's Mad Mark. Today's episode, proof that these Anunnaki gods actually existed and that they were indeed not gods. Also, the real reason for the building of the Pyramids of Giza in Egypt, and the truth about the great black history of the ancient land of Kemmet, now known as Egypt. Yes, this is going to be an eye-opening episode, and you're not going to want to miss a second of it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. I, of course, am Mad Mark, and before I begin, just a quick reminder to please like, share, and comment. It helps so much. I can't even begin to tell you. I would also like to mention that I have created a new Facebook page for the show, and things are really booming over there. I put a link in the show description, so go ahead and follow me over there. I'm hoping that this will become a place where we can all gather to discuss each episode and where you can voice your comments and questions. So please check that out. Today we continue our studies of Zecharia Sitchin's third book, The Wars of Gods and Men, published by Avon Books in 1985. For the past couple episodes, we've been discussing a few of the wars of the Anunnaki gods here on Earth. Please understand that we have only just cracked the surface of this topic. The best is yet to come, I promise. But let's pause now for a moment and take some time to examine why the Anunnaki always seem to be fighting amongst themselves and constantly at each other's throats. A few episodes back, I mentioned that because they created us by utilizing part of their own DNA, that we act a lot like them and vice versa. But there also are major behavioral differences, things that the Anunnaki do that many cultures here on Earth would simply not understand. And it is imperative that we study these differences if we are to be cognizant of why they are constantly battling each other and, likewise, getting us involved in their wars. To better understand this, let's go back once again to when Enki was getting the original bases and operations set up in Mesopotamia. The entire purpose of their mission on Earth was to mine gold, and their efforts to do so in Mesopotamia proved to be much less than successful. So, the decision was made to move the mining operations down to South Africa, where gold was more plentiful. But this was going to cause an incredible strain on Enki. How could he possibly manage the spaceport and the other operations in Mesopotamia and also oversee the mining procedures in South Africa? So, Anu, leader of Nibiru, made the decision to send down his other son and heir to the throne of Nibiru, Enlil, Enki's half-brother, to take over the command of the spaceport. Now, the choice to bring Enlil to Earth may have been a necessary one, but it must have been an agonizing one as well, because it only served to aggravate the pre-existing tensions between these two brothers. As I've explained on past episodes, Enki was Anu's firstborn son, but his mother had been one of Anu's concubines. But then, Anu's wife and half-sister bore another son, Enlil, and by the Anunnaki rules of succession, Enlil became the legal heir instead of Enki. And then, after Enki set up all the operations on Earth, Enlil arrived to take over command. Thus, the tensions between these two half-brothers were on high from that day on. I cannot stress enough the importance of lineage and genealogy to the Anunnaki. Many wars were fought on Nibiru over this right of succession, and likewise, once they came to Earth, the same behaviors continued here. The battles of supremacy were never ending, and I believe that they are still going on to this day. So, if all of these wars of the gods that I have covered thus far on this show have you scratching your head in confusion, this is the reason why. The constant battle to be number one. If they couldn't accomplish their supremacy goals through sex, lineage, and male children, then they would have to take it to the battlefield. I believe that this explains all of the constant wars we see here on planet Earth. I don't believe that the Anunnaki have ever stopped fighting for supremacy on our planet. You hear people talk about shadow governments all the time. Well, there you go. What could be more shadowy than that? Either the Anunnaki themselves, their descendants, or possibly their appointed representatives here on Earth are still making all of the decisions here. It has never stopped. You know, I remember talking to some friends of mine when I was a teenager back in the 70s, and we were discussing why there is never peace on Earth. It seems as though if one country isn't trying to start some shit up, then it's another one. They go at it like rabid dogs, sometimes even drawing other countries into their battles. And many innocent lives are lost. And then, many times a few years later, those same countries become the best of friends. I believe that people are the same wherever you go. We all want love, a home, food on the table, a family. Thanks to social media over the years, I have had the great pleasure of meeting and becoming friends with people from all over the world, and it is truly amazing to me how very similar we all are. I believe that if we could somehow eliminate the governments of the world, all of us people would get along just fine. It really gives you something to think about, doesn't it? Okay, let's return to the topic once again. You will notice, as we continue examining these wars of gods and men, that it will become very clear that they all stem from a code of sexual behavior based not on morality, but on considerations of genetic purity. And at the very core of these wars lies an intricate genealogy that determined hierarchy and succession, and sexual acts were judged not by their tenderness or violence, but by purpose and outcome. Let's take, for instance, the Sumerian story of one of Enlil's escapades, one that is reminiscent of an old tale told years later about King David. It seems that Enlil took a fancy to a young Anunnaki nurse that he saw swimming naked in a river. He persuaded her to go sailing with him and then basically raped her. Now, even though he was the commander-in-chief on Earth at that time, he was soon arrested by the 50 senior gods and found guilty of his crime by the 7 Anunnaki who judge. He was sentenced to exile in the Abzu, or South Africa, which was Enki's territory. But he was eventually pardoned when he ended up later marrying this young goddess. Another story concerned the exploits of Enki. And this tale can only be understood if we bear in mind the Anunnaki code prohibiting marriage but not lovemaking between a brother and his sister. However, you were allowed to marry your half-sister, and a male heir born from a union such as that would have precedence in the hierarchical order. So it seems that Enki was seeking a male son by he and Enlil's half-sister. He basically forced himself on her, and she became pregnant. But the resulting child was a female. So he did it again and again. We're not sure exactly how many times, but each time a female child was the result. Eventually, Enki gave up. But it was all legal under Anunnaki law because it was in an attempt to produce a male heir who would have precedence in the Anunnaki hierarchical order. So, as I said before, if the Anunnaki could possibly reach the top of the hierarchical order through sex in order to achieve their goals, terrific. But if not, they turned to war. So, now at least, you have a little bit better understanding of the behavior of these Anunnaki and what led to many of their wars. In fact, the Anunnaki's initial discovery of gold here on Earth, the discovery which ended up changing our planet forever, was the result of an accident caused by a battle for succession on Nibiru. This is an incident that, once again, we will cover in much more detail on future episodes, but for now, a short recap will do. It was the time for succession on Nibiru. The heir apparent was Anu's father, Anshirgal, but for some reason, another relative by the name of Alelu was appointed as the king. As a gesture of reconciliation, Alelu appointed Anu to the position of royal cupbearer, which was an honored and trusted position. But after 9 Nibirian years, Anu gave battle to Alelu and deposed him on the throne. Now, there is a lot more to this story, and I will cover it all in the future. But to make a long story short, after being disposed as ruler, Alelu got into a ship and made his way to Earth. This was a harrowing journey that will also be covered in more detail down the road. The texts tell us, as Alelu was defeated and he fled before Anu, down he descended to the dark-hued Earth. So, the first Anunnaki to ever set foot on planet Earth was in fact Nibiru's disposed ruler, Alelu. And he discovered gold here. Now, even though the tensions were high between Alelu and Anu, Alelu was sufficiently concerned about the welfare of Nibiru and its degrading atmosphere to alert Anu of his discovery. And that is how the Anunnaki discovered that there was indeed gold here on planet Earth. Okay, time to shift gears and talk about Marduk Amun-Ra once again. I've mentioned before that Marduk, son of Enki, was the same deity known as Amun-Ra in Egypt, which is where he actually rose to prominence. As Marduk, in earlier Sumerian texts, he is mentioned on several occasions. As Enki's son, he had a prominent role in the various events concerning Anunnaki history prior to the Great Flood. But it was after the flood, during the rebuilding and the division of the lands, that Marduk-Ra became a key figure. And we need to understand all of this before we start discussing the Pyramid Wars, which were mostly the result of his arrogance and narcissism. Marduk-Ra wanted to rule over the entire earth. Remember that famous quote from the Bible, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me"? Yeah, that was Marduk. And, of course, he eventually rewrote the Bible to revolve around just one God, himself. So, first, let's take a look at what led up to all of this. In the Bible, following the Great Flood story, it states that, "And the sons of Noah that came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japhet, from whom all of the earth was overspread." And the biblical tale of the flood is followed by the Table of Nations, which describes the historical lineage of these 3 sons of Noah, as well as what lands they settled on, and so on and so forth. It is an interesting document. However, on this show, we are interested mainly in the Anunnaki. But if you're interested in all of that, go ahead and look into it. Okay, so for our purposes here, we are concentrating on what Mr. Sitchin refers to as the spaceport lands: Mesopotamia, where the pre-diluvial spaceport had been; the Cedar Mountain, where the landing place remained functional; the land of Shalem, where the post-diluvial mission control center could eventually be established; and the adjoining Sinai Peninsula, where the future spaceport was located. As the various lands were divided up between the Anunnaki, one area was of specific concern, that being the latter of these, the new spaceport in the Sinai Peninsula. Because whoever controlled that controlled the only link between Earth and Nibiru. As you can imagine, being in control of the spaceport area was of utmost importance. Everyone wanted it for their own, especially the clans of Enlil and Enki. So a special council was held, and the final decision was to award the Sinai area to a neutral party. The solution was ingenious. Of equal lineage to both Enlil and Enki was their half-sister Ninhursag, or Sud, as she was referred to in these texts. Also a daughter of Anu, she bore the title of Ninmah, which meant Great Lady. She was one of the original group of great Anunnaki to settle here on Earth, and a member of the Pantheon of 12. She bore a son to Enlil and daughters to Enki, and she helped create mankind. But she never had been given her own dominion to rule over, so none of the Anunnaki Council opposed this decision. Consider that the Sinai Peninsula must have looked about as foreboding millennia ago as it does today. But although Ninhursag had been given an abode in one of Mesopotamia's rebuilt areas, she preferred to move to a home in the mountains of this new region that she had been given rule over. Proudly she declared, "A mistress I am now. Alone will I stay here, reigning forever." One other fact about this that I was not going to mention because it disgusted me so incredibly when I read it was that she was often called the cow behind her back. The reason for this sickening nickname was because when first arriving on Earth thousands of years earlier, she had been young and beautiful. But now she was old and gray. Now, I would just as soon have left that part out, because as an older person, I find it quite insulting. But then I got to thinking about it. This statement in the ancient texts that Ninhursag was nicknamed the cow because she grew older, it's one of the most exciting statements I've come across in all these ancient texts, and I find it hard to believe that even Zecharia Sitchin missed it. He reported it, and then he moved on to the next subject without missing a beat. But it's an important statement because it proves a few things. First of all, it proves that these beings were real and not just a myth. How, you ask? Because throughout history, whenever humans take the time to portray a god, whether it's in carvings or drawn pictures or paintings, this god is always portrayed in the same way over time. They do not age. Here is an ancient depiction of Buddha, and here is a more modern one. The weight sometimes changes, the poses change, but the age is always pretty much the same. There is no version showing old Buddha. Here's Indra from Hinduism. Old depiction and a newer depiction. Again, the same age. Even the Christian Judeo image of God, who has always looked pretty old from the very beginning, obviously to portray wisdom and fatherhood, always looks about the same. Humans do not age their gods, but the ancient texts do acknowledge that Ninhursag, after thousands of years, was indeed aging. And if she was aging, then she was a real person. The ancients could visibly see her growing older. Now, yes, these Anunnaki do age much slower than we humans do, as I've covered in earlier episodes. One human year is marked by the amount of time it takes for Earth to make one orbit around the sun. The Anunnaki age one Shar every time Nibiru makes one orbit around the sun, and a Shar is 3,600 of our Earth years, which makes them seem to be immortal. One footnote here, which I will cover in more detail in future episodes, is that the longer the Anunnaki stay here on Earth, the faster they start to age. Yes, it's still far slower than us, but over time, their bodies start to adhere to earthly time instead of Nibiruian time. But they still age far slower than we do. But the fact of the matter is that because Ninhursag was noticeably aging, then she had to be real. Because no humans have ever depicted their gods as aging. Why? Because if you age, logic would dictate that you will also eventually die. And gods are not supposed to die. Because if they can die, then they aren't gods at all, right? Which brings me to my second point. These Anunnaki beings from Nibiru were not gods. They were ancient astronauts. They only seemed like gods because they had such unbelievably long lifespans and a lot better tech. And of course, they created us, which would have seemed like an act of God to ancient humans. But they are simply beings from another planet. They do age, and they will eventually die. They are not gods. And if Ninhursag was visibly aging, that means Enlil, Enki, and all the rest of the original Anunnaki assembly of gods who came down to Earth were also aging. And they do so much faster than their counterparts back on Nibiru. In fact, there is a passage which I will talk about in the future, where Anu visited Earth and actually talked about the fact that his sons Enlil and Enki now were looking much older than him, because they were living on Earth and he spent the majority of his time on Nibiru. For this one simple sentence, that Ninhursag was referred to as the cow because she was growing older, not only confirms that she actually existed, but it also confirms that these Anunnaki beings were not and are not gods. So, with Ninhursag now chosen as the ruler of the Sinai Peninsula, it was time to begin laying out and building the new Anunnaki spaceport there. This post-diluvial spaceport was planned utilizing the same principles as the original Mesopotamian spaceport. As you can see from this diagram, the twin-peaked Mount Ararat still served as the major focal point. It was the northern landmark, something that could be seen well from space. It anchored the landing corridor and the landing path in the center of the corridor. The southern line of the landing corridor was a line connecting Ararat with the highest peak in the Sinai Peninsula, that being Mount St. Catherine, and its twin, the slightly lower Mount Moses. The northern line of this grid was a line extending from Ararat through the landing platform of Baalbek and continuing on into Egypt. But in Egypt, the land was too flat to offer any natural landmarks, and it was for that reason that the Anunnaki proceeded to build their own artificial twin peaks, the two great Pyramids of Giza. People have been searching for hundreds of years for the purpose of the Pyramids of Egypt, and now you know. Of course, as we now know also, these structures were far more than just landmarks. They had many uses and purposes as well. We may never discover or understand all of them. I mean, if you're going to take the time to erect some huge structures as landmarks, then you might as well incorporate other uses into them while you're at it. And Enki and Thoth did just that. Okay, time to insert a little history lesson in here. You will continually hear me and, well, everybody else refer to the land of the pyramids as Egypt. And I will continue to do that because it's the name that everyone accepts and has accepted for that region now for centuries. But that name was given to the area by the Greeks, and it is not what the native people of that region called it. Kemmet was its name, the meaning of which was the Black Land, referring to the fertile black soil found along the Nile River. Remember me talking on the last episode of how much Enki raised the land from the mud, muck, and destruction after the Great Flood? How he built dikes and irrigation canals? All of this was essential for agriculture, which allowed the Kemetian society to flourish. This area was not renamed Egypt until it fell under Greek rule in the 8th century BC. The term chemistry is derived from the name of Kemmet. And of course, it is because its god in those days, Ptah Enki, was the great scientist of the Anunnaki. But what did these people look like, these ancient citizens of Kemmet? Well, it is located on the continent of Africa, so it shouldn't surprise anyone that the people of this great land were described as having a variety of brown-colored complexions with black curly hair. And this makes perfect sense because once again the god of Kemmet was Ptah Enki, who created the first humans, those who the Anunnaki referred to as the dark-headed ones. The first humans were black, and their creator, Ptah Enki, was the god of Kemmet. Do you see how this all starts coming together once you know the truth? You know how we in the West are always led to believe that the history of the African people was nothing more than various small, half-naked, unsophisticated, unhopeful, uneducated tribes that were later rounded up and brought to America as slaves? Well, I am here to tell you that that is all bullshit. The truth of the matter is that it was people of color who inhabited this land of Kem, the most powerful and advanced society on Earth from soon after the Great Flood all the way up to around 700 BC. For thousands of years, this great nation of Kemmet was the pinnacle of human society until it was finally conquered in 664 BC by the Persians, then the Greeks, who renamed it Egypt, and finally the Romans. And with the Romans came their Christianity. You know how many of the old Egyptian artifacts have been defaced? Great, important, and historical artwork and monuments destroyed and ruined forever? Well, we have the Christians to thank for that. After the Romans conquered Egypt, Christianity became the dominant religion in the land, and with that came the rejection of the old gods, because, of course, Marduk, who was by then the god of the Christian Judeo faiths, couldn't have anybody worshiping any of the old gods. But of course, the Christian leaders were more than aware of the power that these old gods retained over the people who still worship them. Some particularly zealous Christian church leaders, such as Saint Chenoit and Saint Augustine, advocated for attacks on these idols as a way of demonstrating their failure in the face of Christian might, and they set about defacing as many of them as possible. So now you know the truth about how and why these ancient statues were shamelessly destroyed. But this great and powerful nation of Kemet, renamed Egypt by its conquerors, was a land inhabited by people of color. So, although Hollywood would have us believe that they looked like this, they actually looked like this. And that is where I will leave you for this episode. You have quite a lot to digest there, and we have so much more to cover and learn. I'm Mad Mark, and I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If so, please like, share, and comment. It helps so much. And also, tell your friends and help spread the word about this program. Also, if you have any questions regarding the content that we discuss on this show, just message me through madmarktv.com or on any of my social media platforms. I also wish to remind everyone that listening to this podcast is no excuse to not read the book that we are discussing here, titled The Wars of Gods and Men by Zecharia Sitchin. It is an amazing work, and I am leaving out much of the information in order to keep the podcast flowing properly. So do yourselves a favor and read that book. Who Are the Aliens? The History of the Anunnaki on Planet Earth is written and produced by me, Mad Mark. Today we have taken another step in our ongoing journey to learn the truth. I promise you that things will get more and more interesting the further we delve into this topic of who are the aliens, the history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. Bye for now. You've been listening to Who Are the Aliens? The History of the Anunnaki on Planet Earth with your host, Mad Mark. Join us again on our next program when Mad Mark will once again uncover the answers to the mysteries that puzzle mankind.